All right, everybody, welcome back to 18 Outdoors. Really appreciate y'all's support and your likes and stuff. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Today, we're going to have an interesting conversation with somebody that knows a whole lot about deer, right? So,
I know a few things.
he knows a few things. Anyway, got Chris Cook here. Worked for the Wildlife and Fisheries Department, what they call it now, right? It used to be what it's called.
Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries Division.
Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries Division, okay? We just call it Department of Conservation. But
Game and Fish. I used to catch myself saying that pretty regular. So
anyway, he just retired this past year.
Yeah, April of last year.
April of last year, 30, how many years?
30 years
and 7 months.
That's right.
30 years and 7 months. I mean, so part of that is going, you know, he's had a broad range of seeing what things been going on with, you know, we're going to talk specifically deer, you know, in Alabama. So he knows a lot about what it used to be like and what it is now. And so if you don't mind, I know part of the things back then, they were building population up in part of the states, right. And then maybe the southern part, like, you know, I think you might have been saying earlier, is that they were trying to control some of the population. So then during the state, so y'all had a program, and you actually ended up being the deer program coordinator for how many years were you doing that? So,
well, the title of deer program coordinator, I guess that was created in 2015, I think it was. But you know, since 1997, I was basically doing that as a part of my job. It was basically handling anything deer related, for the most part, down to me.
Wow.
And so the deer program coordinator title, I think it was 2015 or 2017. I don't know, but it was like a title change, but the job didn't change a whole lot. Just that I went from having several other things to do to just basically focusing on those deer specific things when my title changed. So didn't have as many other little tasks to deal with. So it was good, a good move. I thought it was.
I remember, you know, I guess the first time I met you, it had to be your early part of the career was at Wolf Creek Mountain. There, you was biologist there, and that's 30 years. 30
right. Yeah. Crap. Started in August of '93, so left there in May of '95.
Oh, so yeah. So that means, so you've seen about everything pretty much from that standpoint to what you were doing as a coordinator, or what you were doing when you retired, the coordinating part. So kind of give me if you don't care, an overview, and the people that's watching, the overview of what the things were going on, what kind of mindset the upper echelon ever wanted y'all to do as far as the deer program, and then how it progressed into what we got going on now.
Well, initially, most of the WMAs, which is still probably the biggest part of what the Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries Division, the wildlife section, does is management and administrating the hunting and stuff on our wildlife management areas. And so back then, working on the WMA, that was what I was primarily exposed to. I did a little bit of deer management assistance program stuff initially, but working on the WMAs, there was very limited opportunities to shoot does or antlerless deer. So they were trying to increase deer populations on most of them, maintain a population that kept hunters happy, provide them plenty of targets to shoot. But when I moved to Demopolis, my job changed to where I was working primarily with the deer management assistance program, and that it also exposed me to an area that was on the flip side of that, where they had a lot of the region had way more deer than the habitat could support. So the deer management assistance program was very popular, where people could work with a biologist from the department to help them better manage their properties for, you know, to get the population under control, manage for a little bit better quality deer. And most of that, or for most people, it was getting the opportunity to shoot more does to control the population. And that was probably the southern half of the state kind of were facing those issues back then. This was in the mid 90s, late 90s. And over time, those areas of the state where at that time, back in the mid 90s, the populations were pretty, they were low compared to that area. They had a lot of room to grow, and they have grown over the years. And now,
I remember, you couldn't shoot a doe period with a gun for a long time, and then that started in the 90s, right? So
there was very limited either sex seasons across most of the state. They were most counties had had archery. You could shoot a doe with a bow. Had some, and on the WMAs was the same way. They had a few WMA hunts with the muzzleloaders where you could shoot either sex, and then like at Wolf Creek where I was at, I think there was one day of gun season where you could shoot does. I think Oak Mulkey might have had 1 or 2 days. So, and Sam Murphy or Lamarion at that time was that way. So, and then there's other ones that had no doe opportunities during gun season. So, and then across the state on private land, it was very limited as well. In most counties, you had some counties with no days during gun season. Most of them probably had 2 days. Some of the counties with the issues with more and more deer had maybe 11 days, and I think there were 2 counties, Macon and maybe Chambers County, had like 20 days. So it was very limited opportunities to shoot a doe with a modern firearm back in those days. But that's those populations kept increasing, and the need to take more does in a lot of places led to the expanding of the either sex seasons in all across the state. So it definitely changed from the time I started work to when I retired.
Also, I remember years, I guess back in that time frame, you get quite a bit of survey stuff, and they were asking questions about. This is what I want to kind of go into is they ask like every hunter or the ones I filled out, what would you be more interested in, harvesting deer or harvesting more mature bucks? So I was kind of wondering if y'all, because they started changing that thought process a little bit in I guess the late 90s maybe or something. So so was that due to hunter response or due to some of the other states picking up some of that stuff, or what kind of started changing some of that?
Yeah, there was there was desire of hunters and landowners to be able to shoot more deer, and it was a change in mindset across the Southeast, probably not just in Alabama. There's the Quality Deer Management Association was becoming more popular at that time, and that was one of the components of quality deer management that they were promoting, because at that time shooting does was not, a lot of people frowned on it.
Yeah.
And it took a while to get people to even accept that as, even if they didn't do it, to accept that as something that may need to be done in some places. Right. And so
they thought more does meant more bucks.
Yeah. And so the surveys you're talking about, I think I know the first ones that we were done were on our WMAs. I know Barber Wildlife Management Area was the first one to survey hunters and just get an idea of, they'd been getting some comments from the hunters around the check station about wanting to try to have better deer on Barber. Excuse me. And so we put together a survey to ask them those kind of questions. What would you consider to be a successful season or a successful hunt or a quality hunt? Seeing deer, having an opportunity to shoot any deer, having an opportunity to shoot a better buck or any buck, those kind of questions. And they were, the majority of hunters down there favored doing something to promote having better quality bucks, whether that, and that would include shooting more does to keep the population at a level compatible with the habitat. And then that survey was implemented on some other WMAs at the request of the biologists that were on the areas based on feedback they'd gotten from their hunters. So that included Covington, which is now Geneva State Forest and Black Warrior, Lowndes, and then Freedom Hills and Lauderdale. They were all surveyed using basically the same survey, and there was a couple other WMAs that were surveyed, and they didn't. I don't think they didn't get that support, so they didn't implement those changes. But those kind of surveys were used to gauge the interest of the hunters that actually hunted those WMAs. How do you want this area managed? And for the most part, they were well received and have done pretty well since they were implemented.
If I remember right, was Barbara the first one to do the antler restriction?
It was, and then I think the next one was at that time it was Covington WMA, but it was Geneva State Forest down there, and then I think Lowndes was after that, or it might have been.
Well, how did
Lowndes and Freedom Hills and Lauderdale was all about the same time. Then Black Warrior, I think, was right after those.
Oakmulgee.
Then Oakmulgee. See, there weren't any surveys done at Oakmulgee, and most of the ones that have antler restriction. Well, most of them have an antler restriction now.
Right.
And I think Jeff did a survey at Oakmulgee, but it was done regardless of what the survey said. But the survey, the best I remember, the hunters were in favor of doing it too. But they implemented antler restrictions on most of the WMAs, and those antler restrictions weren't super restrictive. They were just to try to get deer protect those 1.5-year-old bucks and get more of them to 2 years old. Right. And there was nothing put in place to try to promote, getting deer to 3+. But by default, if you get more of them to 2.5, you're going to have more of them make it to 3.5, just right. Because they get a little bit better at avoiding hunters as they get a little bit older. So, and then also people were not as quick to pull the trigger if they had to count points. Right. And of course, points they're not the best.
Right. Yeah, I was going to get into it in a second. Yeah. How did that coordinate with when they changed the limit? Used to buck a day for the whole season. So how did the antler restrictions and when did the 3 buck limit go into?
That was it was a few years after the first of the WMAs went to those antler restrictions. It was in I think the mid 2000s, like 2007 or something like that. But anyway,
I think that's right.
But it was there was 4 or 5 of the WMAs that already went to the antler restrictions, and so that was done after that, and so it was again a response to the desires and of the public and other different groups to do something different to try to get those bucks, to give them an opportunity to get a little bit bigger than just a 1.5-year-old deer, based on
right.
what our harvest data was showing. And that was the problem with that was we didn't, we don't collect the age type data off of properties other than DMAP and WMA. So there's a lot of properties where we weren't getting that kind of data. So it was you do surveys and try to gather that info, but there wasn't. That's best I remember. Those questions weren't included on the department's annual hunter survey.
That's the hard part about our state is that what information you get, looking at deer was mainly on the mammoth deers or the state involved program that you had to sign up for. Mm-hmm. The rest of the private land,
right? You
don't have any kind of information on that.
And so it was a challenge to manage. You make recommendations for regional or statewide seasons and bag limits and stuff with using the best data that we had, which was limited based on how data was collected. some private land stuff. It was DMAP type properties, and then WMAs, and then there's a whole lot in between. And so trying to bridge that gap is and was always will be a challenge.
Yeah, that's one of the, kind of get off a little bit. That's one of my thoughts, are like we get in these Facebook arguments or social media arguments about things. A lot of them are all rapping about the public land part. We need to do this, do that, but that's almost like you got a little cup of water involving the whole big ocean. What we can do on the public land is really like kind of spitting ocean.
Right.
It's hard to change everything in the state just by everybody talking about the public land part of it. So because y'all have the conservation part for wildlife and fisheries and all that have very limited control of what goes on.
Right.
Besides the season dates.
Yeah, and that's the only way, for the most part that a state agency can affect what's being killed is seasons and bag limits. It's you can't dictate habitat management practices and other things that's going to have an impact on wildlife populations, the quality and the numbers of them. So it's and then the education part, which you mentioned, that's the part that agencies need to do a good job of, a better job of in a lot of cases is getting out. All right, why are you making these changes, and why do a better job of explaining why and what the goal is, and just changing stuff and saying, well, this is how it is. It's usually not met with
that's one of the biggest things is the communication to the public from the conservation department, wildlife and fisheries. One of the biggest things to me when that CWD thing first happened, they had a plan in place if it happened, right?
Right. Yep.
And then when it happened, they really didn't put out the plan beforehand, and then they just said, all right, this happened, this is what we're doing. And they had a meeting, and it was kind of a shock, and everybody was up at a big uproar because of what was going to happen, because really it wasn't kind of brought up ahead, before that. So, and there's been a few other things that get changed that there's not any, advice or communication or questionnaires, like they changed some, say like wearing hunter's orange on that WMAs, and you don't have to on private land when you're squirrel hunting or something like that. So when there's no scientific reason or no accident reason, nobody's been shot squirrel hunting or anything.
I have a problem with that myself.
So
like if you're going to do it based on who's getting shot, you need to be putting orange on duck hunters and duck hunters.
Turkey hunters.
Most of the two-party shooting incidents occur when people are bird hunting. And it's usually it's ducks and doves, So that's like, no, well, that's different. It's like, well, I'm like you. That's like, show me the last time a squirrel hunter was shot by another hunter, Right. But it's it was done. I don't know how that decision was made, but anyway, it was done. And you find out about it when you get the regulations for WMA. So
right,
but on the CWD plan, it's on the website. Was on the website, and the way it is written is that it doesn't lay out, because the situation is going to be different, potentially different when it's discovered. Like with the one in the first one that was detected in Lauderdale County, it was found during hunting season, so that made it gave the department an option to change those bag limits and whatnot during the remainder of the season to get more samples, to try to get a better handle on the distribution of the disease up there, and then also prevalence within the population. But it's hard to put in a plan like that ahead of time, that we're going to do this, and this when it if a positive is found, because it may be like some of these other counties where it's a deer that is found as roadkill deer is picked up in the summer, and so it's not during hunting season. So
right.
You'll have to take a little bit different approach. But it was, there were some areas where it could have been a little bit better promoting why this was done and why that wasn't done. But what added to the fuel to the fire was all the misinformation that was put out there by people that had not read the plan and hadn't bothered to try to get up with anybody to get their questions answered. So they were just throwing stuff out there to get clicks. So
while we're on that, what is CWD? CWD. What is it?
Well, chronic wasting disease is a disease that's caused by a protein body that becomes mutated and becomes infectious. So it makes other of those prions infectious. So that means they can make, when they come in contact with that same type of protein part, they can make it infectious. It's in the group of diseases called TSEs, or transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. It's similar diseases in cattle or mad cow disease, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy. In sheep and goats, it's called scrapie. And then the human most similar prion disease, or TSE, in humans are similar to CWD is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. It's unlike most infectious agents like viruses or bacteria or fungi or something like that. Those prions are not susceptible to vaccines or enzymes or other agents that can break it down, or even cleaning substances if it gets on stuff. And so that makes it very difficult to control once it gets on the landscape. It takes, once a deer is exposed to it, it'll take it a few months before it will start becoming infectious, where it can infect other deer. And then it takes even longer before it will start showing any signs of being sick. So a deer may have it for a year, 18 months before it's really showing any outward signs of being sick. But it's out there walking around potentially infecting healthy deer for quite a while before it ever shows any signs of being sick. They shed those prions through saliva, urine, feces, blood, and those, anytime those prions are shed, they create a potential exposure to other animals. And so while most of the infections are from deer to deer, once it's established in a population and those deer are depositing those prions across the landscape, at watering holes or feed sites or just anywhere, then they're creating a secondary route of infection. So the other deer doesn't have to be there. They can pick those prions up if they stick their muzzle down to eat the same place that some of these other deer that are infected deposited prions. Now, whether it takes them, how many exposures it takes before they get enough to where they become infected, I don't think that's been determined. But researchers at Mississippi State have shown that those prions can be found at feeders, they can be found at scrapes or licking branches and stuff. So there's a lot of different routes for deer to potentially be exposed to CWD outside of just deer-to-deer contact. Again, the deer, it's 100% fatal. That doesn't mean that the deer will die, will be found as skin and bones dead, like typically the pictures that are published of deer with CWD, that's what they show. But most of the deer that have CWD look perfectly fine because it takes that year to 18 months or longer to start showing signs of being ill. But most of the deer that get killed and get tested and are positive for CWD look perfectly fine. But there's, that disease is progressing, from the time they get it until they start showing signs. It's progressing, so it affects their central nervous system. It affects their brains. Those prions concentrate in the central nervous system and the brain, so it affects their ability to function. It affects their brain, and so they become more susceptible to to other ways of getting killed. So they become more susceptible to getting hit by cars, or in areas where they have predators, become more susceptible to being killed by, coyotes or mountain lions or whatever. They also become just more susceptible to having accidents. They're just not functioning like they normally would. So you hear a lot of people say there's more deer killed, by hemorrhagic disease than there are CWD. Well, that's probably true, because CWD is not found everywhere. Hemorrhagic disease is found pretty much everywhere and happens every year, and it's caused by a virus. But it doesn't. They're completely different diseases, and it's not a long-term issue like hemorrhagic disease is not a long-term chronic problem like CWD is, because once CWD is established, it's not going anywhere. And so what happens over time, the prevalence, meaning the percentage of deer that have it in the population, increases faster in some situations. You can implement some practices like trying to get people to harvest more deer to keep the population down. So you're potentially minimizing the amount of deer-to-deer interactions. So you're slowing the spread of it, slowing the increase in prevalence. But once it gets to a certain point, say like 30+% of the population has it, then what these other states that have had it for decades are finding is, then you start seeing issues with population declines attributed to CWD.
Really?
They're not losing 50% of the population. It may be a 10% long-term population decline, because what happens is, because it affects their ability to do normal deer stuff, you would expect it to affect a doe's ability to raise her fawns. Now she'll still be bred and have fawns over the 2 or 3 years that she's maybe infected but still functioning normally, but she may be not able to function as well as she did before she got CWD. So she's not doing as good a job as raising her fawns as she did before. And then also potentially it's going to affect the average lifespan of a deer. So where say a doe in those areas with a real high prevalence, they may have had an average lifespan of 4 years. That goes down to 3 years, and so they're not living as long, so they're not potentially having as many fawns. And so it's not going to doesn't appear that the disease will completely wipe out the population, but what they're seeing in areas such as Arkansas and like Southwest Tennessee, where the disease has obviously been there for 20+ years, based on the prevalence. There's researchers are finding that their mortality rates are increasing, or survival rates are a lot lower for deer that have CWD as opposed to deer that don't have it in their radio collar studies. So doesn't appear that Alabama's anywhere close to having those kind of prevalence rates, but over time it will continue to creep up. It's just inevitable how the disease works and how you can't get rid of it off the landscape once it's there. So it's up to the hunters and the agencies to try to do things to try to minimize or slow the risk, or slow the spread, I should say,
right,
and slow that increase in prevalence. So it's unfortunate that you can't get rid of it, but there's a lot of research continuing to be done on it, trying to find out more and more things, especially like the impacts of different management approaches, what works best to try to slow the spread while also maintaining that huntable population that can keep hunters out there hunting, because that if hunters quit hunting in these areas, that's just going to increase the deer population and increase the rate of spread. So it's a double-edged sword, because it's frustrating from talking to the folks in these other states in these areas that have high prevalence rates. It's frustrating for these hunters that are trying to do their part, continue to hunt, get deer tested, and 2 out of 3 deer that they kill come back as being CWD positive, and it's while nothing so far indicates that it can cross over into humans. The Centers for Disease Control recommends that if you're hunting in an area that has CWD, so like if you were hunting in Lauderdale, Colbert County, they recommend that you have the deer tested for CWD, and if it comes back as being positive, to not eat the meat. That's what they're recommending.
Right.
And so if hunters are getting to where they're reluctant to hunt because the deer they're killing, has a pretty good chance of having CWD, then that just exacerbates the problem, and it's unfortunate. But it doesn't appear that it'll completely wipe out the population, but it long term it will cause a decline to some degree.
Now, back to the spreading part, like you was talking about a doe having it and raising babies. Could that transfer to the baby as it being born from her? Or have they proven that?
I think what the latest shows is that I don't think they've been able to conclude that they get it in utero before they're born. But with the way it's spread, they're going to get it pretty soon after being born, just because all the interactions between the doe and the fawn, with the licking and nursing and everything else. There's a lot of exchange of saliva and whatnot. So it's they get it shortly after if they're born to a doe that has it.
Now, what about predators spreading it? So
the research that's been shown is it doesn't appear to infect the predators, but they can. Those prions can, at least a percentage of them will go through the gut of those predators, and so they can deposit in their feces. And so it's whether it's a substantial risk or not is debatable, just because they don't, like a coyote, a scavenger. That's probably more of a risk, where they're scavenging either part from where hunters kill deer or deer. They find deer that have died and they eat it and it ends up being a CWD positive deer. They're not depositing their feces in the same spot day after day. Now they'll put it on the roads, and stuff like that, pretty close. But that's probably not as concentrated a dose, if you will, of the prions as, say, around a mineral lick or a watering hole or a feed or something like that. Yeah. So it's a potential risk, but it's not.
But it could spread like that.
Yeah, or like it, even it's potentially anytime there's prions put out there.
It goes in the ground and stays on the ground.
It stays there in that top layer of soil, and it can be uptaken by plants. And so there's a lot of other routes of potential infection that they haven't.
So you're saying if a plant absorbs that?
Yeah, a plant can take it up. They've shown that in ag crops out in the
Midwest,
out west, where they've been looking at it. So
what about they still have that program where they feed them eagles and dead deer? Could that transfer the same way?
They've quit doing it.
Okay.
They, at least last I remember, they quit.
Well, that's good. Well, that is a potential,
because they were picking up roadkill deer close to where the sites were and putting it in there. But it's I don't think they did it at Oak Mulgee the last couple of years, which is one of the sites that they were trapping and radio transmitting eagles over the last quite a few years, and so golden eagles. Yeah. And so
I was wondering about that part, if it could transfer just to the ground a little bit. Yeah. Now, what about, you said, like, if one dies and its carcass has been say demolished into water, could water carry that? And just because they've had some crazy jumps, it pops up here and it's never been even close to it.
I wouldn't think it would be a high enough. Again, I'm not the expert by any means. I wouldn't think that would be a high enough concentration of prions because you mentioned earlier about I forgot what you were referring to, like spitting in the ocean.
Yeah.
You putting those prions, which they're concentrated in that spinal cord and brain, you're putting that into a creek or a river, and it just, as it goes down creek, it's magnified or diluted, not magnified. But the probably the biggest risk with deer carcasses or dead animals is probably from disposing of carcasses from, say, you're hunting you go hunt, and it's one reason that they have the primary reason that they have the transport rules they have when they started out on out-of-state deer coming into Alabama, where it had to be deboned and no whole heads is because you kill an elk or a mule deer or a whitetail or something that has CWD in another state and bring it back and process it at home, and then throw the bones and skull or whatever else leftover parts out somewhere. You might throw it out in your back 40. You can take it and throw it out on national forest, and people do that year after. They go hunt those areas year after year after year, and if they're not getting their deer tested, they don't know what they're doing, and so potentially that definitely could be a route of infection in new areas, or a processor or taxidermist that gets deer from out of states, and now those rules have changed, so the risk is greatly reduced because if they follow the state's laws or regulations, then they're leaving those high risk parts where they found them, and so the best way to avoid any of that, even if within the state, if you do your own deer and are processing your own deer and disposing of those waste parts, ideally you would bury it on the site where you killed it, or you could potentially bag it and have it taken to a landfill and buried at the landfill. Probably the least desirable, but also probably a lot better option than just throwing it out wherever is to take it back to the property where it was killed, and you can just dispose it on top of the ground. Now, if a deer had CWD, it's on that area, it's in that area, it's already present on the landscape. So putting those parts back out there is not significantly increasing the likelihood of a deer catching it there. He's still more likely to pick it up from another deer, but that's better than potentially putting a CWD positive carcass out, from that was killed in County X and putting it out somewhere in County Y and potentially creating a new exposure.
Well, as of right now, they're like you said, there was no potential for some kind of crazy vaccine or no cure. So
no, just because of how the prions are, they've been researching prion diseases in livestock and humans for decades, way before CWD was known, and so. Well,
CWD basically was like 1968 or 69
67 is when they first figured something was, they identified a malady going on with some deer in a research facility in Colorado, and then it was described as a TSE shortly after that, and then I guess it showed up in the wild I think it was the early 80s.
Well,
so
if scabies is similar, they kind of pretty much eliminated it, right?
Well, it doesn't. I don't think it kills the sheep and goats, but they've known about it for hundreds of years,
right? And so
it affects, and it's transmitted differently. I think it's sexually transmitted actually, but I may be wrong on that. But
it's actually like a different type of disease.
Yeah, they've known it's caused by prions, and it's considered a TSE, but it doesn't affect them, and that's like we're talking about the risk of humans contracting it. That's from hearing some stuff from some researchers that have been looking at those things. One of the things is to consider is like, all right, if it does cross over, how's it going to manifest in humans? What's it going to look like? It may not look like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the human TSC. It may be completely different symptoms and stuff. So but as of now, it's not.
Well, there's been so many people. I mean, like we've been going to Wyoming for a long time. I've been hunting in the CWD zone, and I think I've had one deer tested.
Yeah.
So most people.
Yep.
don't test them, whatever.
Yeah. And the thing with the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans, it just occurs spontaneously in a really low it's like one every so many million people will get it. So if there was a very slight uptick in the occurrence of that disease in the public, it'd be hard to figure out exactly if it was an uptick or just there was 3 people or 5 people got it this year instead of 4. Is that just a blip, or is it something? And so they've been looking at the occurrence of those type diseases in areas where CWD's been known to be around for a little while, and I don't think there's anything conclusive have been drawn from any of that, but nothing out there so far indicates that it has crossed. It seems to be a pretty species specific disease, but those, like with most of the infectious agents that cause disease, they're always mutating and changing. So you never say never with that. You just gotta be aware of what the potential could be and make sure you're doing what you can to make sure you're avoiding any issues.
Well, what about, is there a chance that some deer are just basically immune to that, or?
They've shown that there's some deer that are more resistant to getting it.
Wow.
They will get it, but it takes them longer to show symptoms, and so they still will get it and it still will die, but it takes longer for it to affect them, and so there's not any deer, not any whitetails or anything that I'm aware of that they've shown are immune to it for sure. They just have a delayed. They have a delayed. There's some genotypes that are it impacts them quicker, and then there's some that will get it and the symptoms and ultimate fatalities are delayed.
Well, I read something that were some deer breeders or something, and I thought I read where a state was thinking about releasing some kind of deer that they think.
And so what that would do is they would get it, but they would live longer.
Okay.
And so that was I think it was it Oklahoma? I think that was pushing
something like that.
And the breeders are very strong in Oklahoma, so just take that for what it's worth. So.
But is there a potential for some kind of strain of deer or some kind of bioengineered deer to be immune to it, or whatever you think?
I don't know. I don't think so. And like I said, it's not the end of deer hunting. It's just that the management approach would be a little bit different. And once it gets to those really high prevalence rates, it becomes a whole lot tougher to raise deer to 4 or 5 years old. So that will be a challenge. And then you won't need to take as many does to keep the population at a level compatible with the habitat, just because they're not living as long and potentially not having as many fawns. And so it doesn't appear that it's the end of things. It's just that the problems become people are less likely to hunt those areas. And so the deer will still be there. They can still be managed to for the most part like they have been. Just they won't quite live as long, but hunters will be resistant to hunt there just because they don't want to hunt an area where CWD's at, and the hassles that are the perceived hassles that's associated with it, with rules that are in place that they might not agree with or not want to deal with, like with maybe mandatory testing or no baiting, no feeding, that kind of thing, and then also like I mentioned earlier about the potential of killing a deer or two that year and then it coming back positive and you're not able to eat it, because a lot of most people that are deer hunting, that's a big part of hunting is to get that venison and eat it. And so if you're putting all those resources into hunting and managing properties and whatnot, and you 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 of the deer you kill is positive or higher. I know, talking to folks that work in Mississippi, they've had some folks that they just are right in the middle of the hot zone and they'll have 2 out of 3 deer end up being positive, and so that becomes that'll
that's a problem.
that makes it you quickly lose your enthusiasm about going hunting in those areas.
In fact, I talked to a guy that I met somewhere, and he was somewhere he lived. I think he said in Tennessee that 2 out of 3 that he killed this year had it. So,
and then you hopefully you don't quit hunting completely. You just maybe end up going hunting somewhere else, but because that hunting it, you don't want to see it going away for sure. Want people to keep hunting for various reasons.
Well, all the doom and gloom, whatever. But the biggest, like my lifetime, like your lifetime, that like we might not even see it in these counties down here, but we never know.
I don't think we'll, and I just don't think it'll be based on what appears to have happened in other states. It'll probably be 20 plus years before you're even seeing things close to being to the levels where it's significantly impacting populations in Lauderdale, Colbert County, where we know it's at now. But you just never know where it's liable to show up in the state. The state's been doing surveillance for it, but
they don't cover
when you
everything.
start, they
don't stop them from walking across the lines. And
you think about the number of deer that you would have to sample to say, you have a 95% confidence that it's only occurring that it doesn't occur in X percentage of the population. You'd have to sample a lot of deer.
Right.
It's just like in Georgia. They found their first positive way over northeast of Valdosta, which is significantly further from that positive in Florida, which that's probably, if I had to guess, they probably thought, well, if we find it, it's going to be kind of like with Alabama. If we find it, it's going to be close to where those positives are in the adjoining state. It's going to be close for Georgia. It's going to be close to the one that Florida found in northwest Florida. That's why Alabama was sampling like we were sampling in Lauderdale, Colbert, and Franklin counties prior to finding it, was because of what they were finding in Mississippi and Tennessee.
Yeah.
When you're talking about CWD, there's a lot of different holes you can go down. You start talking about different scenarios about, well, what if this, what if that, and unfortunately, because the disease is so slow progressing, and it takes a while to spread and increase to levels where research seems to indicate there's some long-term impacts on the populations. It takes a while for those kind of that kind of research to be done. But fortunately, there's a lot of good research, or a lot of new research. I think it's about to come out of Arkansas. They've got some good stuff where they've been doing in northwest Arkansas, where they have some pretty high prevalence rates. It should be published here shortly, showing the impacts of that disease once it gets to those high prevalence rates. It's not good from what I've been told. The outlook's not too good, but it's to be expected when you're talking about certain areas having 40+% of the adult population having it. So
wow.
You got the same thing going on in that north central Mississippi, southwest Tennessee, right in the heart of where that really high prevalence of CWD is. Same thing in West Virginia, where they've had it for 25 years. In Wisconsin just published some stuff. They've just published some stuff showing some significant impacts on the population in that south central, I guess, part of Wisconsin, where they found it back in 2001, 2002. So.
Yeah, that's like one of the main hubs where it come from for people hunting there for trophy hunting and stuff like that. So that's
it's gotten pretty ugly up there. From you look at the prevalence rates of the percentage of deer that are positive that are tested, of the hunter harvested deer that are tested up there is pretty high in those hottest areas.
Well, let's kind of go off that doom and gloom subject, because that's. But anyway, people. It's good to kind of be aware of it, and know of it. So hopefully, with this new technology or whatever coming out, something might. Who knows? I don't know. But anyway, But again, it's something we got to live with for sure.
Yeah, and it's not. It's like again, it's not the end of deer hunting in those areas. It's just you may have to change your mindset on how you're going about it. Right. So it's definitely something to keep in mind and to do do what you can to help agencies when they're trying to come up with the best approach to keep it from impacting more hunters than it has to.
Right. Now you brought up EHD. What is that?
EHD, hemorrhagic disease is a virus that affects whitetail deer.
It's the same as blue tongue, right?
And hemorrhagic disease is caused by two different viruses, the epizootic hemorrhagic disease virus, EHD virus, or the blue tongue virus. They're very similar viruses, so they're kind of just under that hemorrhagic disease umbrella. It's been known about since I know back in the 60s, state agencies started funding what became known as the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study over at the University of Georgia Vet School, trying to figure out what was going on with this. Something's going on with deer in the summers in these states, and so it was kind of that was kind of all found. The SCWD, as that unit's called, was all founded on what eventually became hemorrhagic disease. But what it is a virus that's transmitted by little biting flies during the summer months. Typically, it'll start being active in July, and it'll go typically until first frost, whenever the insects are killed back. It's pretty much all over the whitetails range in the southeast. It's found everywhere, but it affects deer differently according to where you're at. While CWD is 100% fatal, if a deer gets it, they're eventually going to die from it if nothing else kills it. Hemorrhagic disease is not that way. In most of Alabama, it appears that most deer just will get sick from it, and then they get over it. And then the good thing about it is, as with most viruses, once a deer is exposed to it this year, they develop antibodies to it. So if they're exposed to that same strain of virus the next year, they're not even going to get sick. It's just like chicken pox in humans. Once you get it, you develop antibodies to it, and you're not exposed to it. So that's a good thing. But as you move north in the whitetails range, they can be the mortality events are a lot more significant. It's rare, based on what I've saw over my time with the state. It's rare that there would be an instance where there would be 10% of the local isolated population die from hemorrhagic disease in a year. Most of them just don't. If there's 10% of the deer population die in August, September, October, people's gonna find dead bodies in Alabama, even though it's hot, because they're out there, they're scouting or they're getting ready for hunting season. They're gonna find them. As you move north, even just like into Tennessee, they can have mortality events where there's 30+% of the deer die in a single season, and those are really significant die-offs, but they bounce right back from it because of the ones that don't die, they have the antibodies, and so it's like probably about a 5-year cycle where it's real active for this year. Then it's not as active because there's a big percentage of the population have those antibodies, but as you get more years where they haven't had significant outbreaks, there's less and less deer with antibodies, and so you're setting up for another event where there's more deer dying. But in Alabama and other very deep southern states, the significant die-offs are minimal, if any. Over my time, probably the only areas where it appeared to be some pretty good die-offs where it might have been 10% would be like in Jackson County, Limestone County, Lauderdale County, those very northern tier counties. You get down in the southern half of the state, it's rare to get any reports of dead deer. And the state, all agencies all across the country have do an annual hemorrhagic disease survey. And so what they're doing is they'll report to that group at the University of Georgia SCWD. They'll report how many deer, or if they had mortality events that were confirmed either by necropsies, where the staff examined the deer and confirmed that it was likely hemorrhagic disease, or they drew blood and had it tested for the antibodies, or they were able to isolate the virus, or more commonly, if they examined hunter harvested deer in hunting season, and they noticed that the deer had their what's called sloughing hooves. And many of your hunters may have seen this before. Deer that are exposed to hemorrhagic disease, they get the virus, and it's a very short-lived virus. It only affects them for just a few days, and then they get over it, and they have varying degrees of issues. Sometimes there's nothing, but sometimes for a lot of them, the virus affects soft tissues of the body, so they'll get ulcers in their mouth or on their tongue, and it also will interrupt the growth of their hooves. And so, as the new hoof starts growing, it's pushing off that old hoof.
Well, something I've heard and kind of noticed is the EHD affects more mature bucks for some reason. And can you kind of explain that? Or
Well, I think probably what happens with that is, as I mentioned about how there will be an outbreak, and the deer that don't die from it will have antibodies, and so you'll go several years without a lot of activity, so you get more and more deer in the population without antibodies, and then you'll have one of those perfect storm years where it's I know in some of the some states they've been able to show a pretty clear connection between really wet weather like in June, early July, followed by dry spells, really dry, because that creates all these standing water, and then they dry up, and so you've got a lot of muddy areas around sites, and so you have a more significant year that year, a lot more insects of those insects. And so if it's been 4 or 5 years since they were a significant event, then you've got potentially a lot of 3, 4, 5-year-old deer that don't have the antibodies. And so on a really bad year in a population that hasn't been exposed to it for several years, you're likely to see some of those better bucks die, those older bucks. And those are the ones that's going to get reported, and there's going to be some 4 or 5-year-old does out there that are dead too, but may not get reported as often as a buck with a big set of antlers. They get a lot more. You don't see a lot of big does on the front of a hunting magazine, so you don't get a lot of people reporting a dead doe as opposed to a big buck if they find it. So
right. Well,
I think that's probably more about it, but it's probably just the timeline on when there was a real active hemorrhagic disease year, followed by several years of not having activity, and then you get a bad year, and there's more deer that are susceptible to it in the population.
Right. So generally in Alabama, or maybe in most of the South, we don't really have to worry about that affecting, like in Montana or somewhere. Yeah. I remember in Montana a few years ago, several years back, they had like wiped the herd out.
It would be like 40-50%, and again, that's in local populations. It's not like across the entire state. But if you hunt or on land in those isolated populations that are impacted by a significant outbreak, then it's a big concern. But that's like I said, that's basically when you just move just north of here, like starting in Tennessee and moving north, you see those kind of events. So
wow. All right, let's what's your thoughts on the 3-buck rule?
I think it's definitely made a lot of hunters rethink about pulling the trigger on every antler buck, of course, and so it's changed the mindset over the years about I don't have to kill every buck I see. And so it's I think in a lot of areas, if not most areas, it's probably helped the age structure of the bucks that are available for harvest. People aren't shooting every buck they see. Now some people are. They're not going to report every deer they see. They're going to shoot every buck they see. They still it's just they're going to do it out of protest. But and it's just like with we was talking about earlier about doe harvest. That was a big hurdle back in the late 90s and early 2000s, where there was definitely areas where they needed to be killing more deer, but it was hard to get people to change that mindset of the sacred doe, and I can't shoot that doe because she's the mama of next the future bucks.
Right.
And so it's the same thing with the buck harvest mentality. It's I've got to shoot. I'll shoot every buck I see, regardless of how big his antlers is, just because I feel like that's my right, or that's the way I always did it. But more and more people see the benefit of not shooting every buck and letting them get another year or two older, and the quality of deer that they can get just by letting them get a little bit older. So I think, and this is that's kind of the same kind of response I probably get from most of the people I've talked to about it. It's oddly, there's probably more people. I would say there's probably more people that would argue for us go to 2 bucks a year as opposed to why can't we shoot 5? It's just it's strange how things have changed over 15, 20 years. But I think for the most part, it's people have seen the benefit of having that kind of making that kind of change, because it just wasn't wise to have it where you could shoot a buck a day every day of a season as long as we have. And so it just if nothing else, it made people think about the impacts of how they had been doing and what the potential benefit of letting a few bucks pass could be. And I think they saw the results. And we talk about the management areas and the size limits, and I know a lot of those guys that hunt on the WMAs, they have really embraced those changes because they were able to see it pretty quick. Where some of those areas where 60-70% of the buck harvest was yearling bucks, and then they made it illegal to shoot those deer, and it didn't take long for that to change what those hunters were seeing when they were in the woods. They were seeing those 6 and 8.2 and 3 year olds and getting a chance to shoot them, where in the past if they didn't shoot that spike that they saw first thing, somebody else was going to shoot it more than likely. So it definitely is a definite change in the mentality or the mindset of hunters on public and private land.
Right. And the dumbest buck or dumbest deer in the woods is generally a young buck, so
absolutely
they were more successful. So you said something about the antler restriction part. So how is the antler restriction? How do you think that as using that as a management tool? Is that, I know it's probably not the best scenario, but it's just
the reason I think I might have mentioned it when we come up with the antler point restrictions on the WMAs. What I did was take all that data from, because anybody grew up hunting on the WMAs in the 70s and 80s and 90s know if you were hunting on a gun day, you had to bring that deer, and to kill the deer, you had to bring it by the check station, and they were weighing it, measuring antlers, and pulling the job on to get age. So we had a pretty good data set from all the WMAs. So I was able to go in there and look at, all right, what's going to be the best criteria to put in place to get a deer to 2 years old, which is what we were doing, and what's going to be something that not only be effective, but to be easy for hunters to follow. So the easiest thing is to count points. Yeah. Now, what happens with that is you're going to protect all those young deer, but what you're also going to do is you're going to also protect some mature deer that just they just don't grow antlers as big as others. We probably think back to being in school talking about the bell curve. In most cases there's the underperformers on the left side. The middle is the average group of whatever. It could be height, it could be grades or whatever, and then the far right of that bell curve is the overperformers, the best of the best. And so when you start looking at antler points, you're going to start protecting that left side of the bell curve. And so those deer are going to make it to 2 years old and 3 years old and 4 years old. And so there'll be some, and that can be frustrating for hunters. They'll go out there hunting in an area that say it's got a 3 on one side rule, and they'll see a big 4-point that weighs 175 pounds that they can't shoot. And he's obviously 3 years old or older. And that's the problem with the antler points, because it's not a good measure of age. Right. ideally, if you're going to use antler criteria, you would use something like beam length or spread. That typically, if you have to use antler restriction, at least what I found in most of West Central Alabama, where I did most of my work, is you would use a combination of beam length and inside spread. And for most properties, if you're trying to get a deer to say to 3 years old, it would be the deer would need to have either an 18-inch main beam or a 14-inch inside spread. What that means is if he has one of those, then there's a high probability that he's going to be 3 years old or older. But it also works a whole lot better. It protects a lot more of those 2-year-old and younger deer from being harvested. Because I mentioned on the points about you're letting those underperformers slide through. Well, what you're also doing is you're potentially taking the overperformers in the 1.5-year-old class out, because they're liable to be a 6-point or a 5-point 1.5-year-old deer, even in areas where 70% of the 1.5-year-old class is a spike. You're going to have those, and nothing's to say they're going to be the super deer at 3 or 4 years old, but they're off to a great start. And so the likelihood of them being that exceptional deer at 3 or 4 years old is pretty good based on that. And same thing with the beam and inside spread criteria. Nothing to say that the bucks that will meet those criteria at the 2-year-old age class that you're trying to protect won't turn into super deer in 3 or 4 years or 2 or 3 years. But they're off to a great start, and they probably will. Because you hear a lot of people talking about why aren't they more 150-inch deer killed in Alabama? So, well, they're being shot as 130-inch 3-year-olds. They're not being allowed to get to 4 and 5 years old. So people are.
With 130-inch 3-year-olds a whopper.
Yeah,
in Alabama.
And but they're the ones on the right side of that curve. They're the ones that's going to be 160, right. And better. And so you got to. That's why when you're talking about buck harvest criteria, ideally you're going to look at the whole animal, the body and everything, and that gives you a whole lot better indication of what his actual age is, rather than just looking at the antlers. What I always recommend to people is just don't even look at the antlers if you can, but it's hard for people not to look at them and just look at the rest of the body. And there's a lot of good educational material about age of deer on the hoof, but it sure works if you're trying to pass bucks and let them get older. So
it's just harder in the woods with the shadows and stuff. Than when looking at one individual deer with a body trying to figure out something. But,
that what I was talking about with the buck restriction, it made people or the buck limit, it made people pause and think about before they shot a buck with antlers. And in the past, if it had an antler, and they didn't have to rethink. They didn't have to think about it. They just could pull up and shoot it if it saw it had antlers, and they could worry about how many points they had later on. So.
Yeah. Well, and the SOAs in Alabama, that's their criteria now. Is they got a beam restriction and or spread or something. So
that's why we put that in place is to have it works a whole lot better than at points, because you can look at some of the deer that's been killed in some of the SOAs. If they had a 4 on one side rule, a lot of those bucks wouldn't have been eligible for harvest because they were just big 6 points. And so, and same way with, there's still some down there, like I know at Portland, the City Creek, you get them on camera and see them that they just have poor quality antlers. They just won't meet that criteria. But it's hard to, if it was private land and it was you on your property, you could make that call. All right, I can tell that deer is mature. But doing that on public land where you have all kinds of levels of experience and looking at mature deer or even bucks in general, it's hard to give somebody a green light. If you think even though his antlers aren't quite big enough, go ahead and shoot him if you think he's old enough. Because what'll happen is ends up shooting those young deer that don't meet the criteria.
That gets into like some of the cull buck thing. A lot of discussion about that. Then I'll get your thoughts on it, because I've read and done a lot of, or seen a lot of things. About people say, hey, got to shoot that cull buck. It's got one beam, one spike on one side or whatever. But it comes from a lot of stuff I've read. even though you try to do that by taking care of them, because you think they're a cull buck, that the doe actually
Yeah.
puts out that gene as much
Oh, yeah.
or more than a buck, right?
Yeah, they contribute. They contribute half the genetics to both to their offspring, but they also, you got to figure in that doe is the one that's carrying that fetus, and then once it's born, she's the one that's feeding it. And so if she's a better at finding the best food, while she's carrying that fawn, and then she's also better at finding the best food and producing the best quality milk, then that fawn's going to get off to a better start than a doe that may not be as good as the mother. But the thing with cull bucks is there's been a lot of research that looked at how heritable those different antler traits are. So, meaning how true is what an antler is, what a sire's antlers look like. How true is it to what his offspring's going to look like? So if he has a 20-inch spread, how likely will his offspring have that same spread? Or if he has 10 points, how likely will his offspring have 10 points? And for most antler traits, they've shown repeatedly that those traits are pretty low. They have low heritability, so you can't predict based on what the sire's antlers look like. You can't predict what his offspring is going to look like. But with does, there may be a little bit better indicator if she's just a better producer. But it's not just genetics; it's just how she raises them. And with the antler things, especially the one-sided abnormalities, most always that's from an injury to the body or to the antler, growing antler to the pedicle. So it's just what I've found over the years. Most of the time, a cull buck is just somebody justifying them shooting another buck. There's no. It's not a management. It's not helping anything with the management stuff. And the only time, what I recommend to folks, if a buck is, say you're trying to manage for deer that are 4 years old and older, and that deer's 4 years old or older, and he's, regardless of what his antlers are, you go ahead and shoot him, but don't use that as a justification to shoot that 3-year-old, because it may be an injury that he overcomes, and next year he's healthy and he's more fully expressing his potential as a 4-year-old, and so anyway, but yeah, it's hard to justify most of the culls that you see people shoot if they're not. It goes back to the age criteria. If they meet that age criteria, it shouldn't matter what his antlers look like. Go ahead and shoot him. But in the big picture, you're not changing a thing in the genetics world out there, because there's that antler genetics are so complex, and they're not heritable, or not as strongly heritable as some other traits. And then there's also that constant flow of deer from one population to the other, especially among bucks. So you can pass those 1.5-year-old bucks, and then a big percentage of them is going somewhere else. The bucks that you're seeing on your property likely weren't born there. They were born, 1.5 miles, 2 miles, 3 miles away, and came there. But those does are there. The does don't disperse as young deer like bucks do. So main thing you can do is to, if you're trying to manage a property, is to get the habitat right, and then try to manage to get deer to a certain age, and then for the most part, their antlers are going to be pretty nice for their age if you're doing everything else right. And then, but again, you can't account for injuries and other things that can cause those abnormal looking antlers.
Well, say this year is the worst bout of cold weather we've had in several years. I'm assuming every deer alive in Alabama has never had this amount of cold, especially in the stretch over the last month where it's teens, 20s, and another kind of bad factor is before that we've had a drought for a pretty good while, right. So a lot of natural browse got knocked down. So what kind of effect do you think that will be on the antler production for the following season? So
yeah, I think that of those two, the drought and the potential impacts it had on food leading into the winter is going to be the one that will affect antler growth for next year. If those deer are entering the winter in a little bit less quality condition than they would in a normal year, because it was real dry towards the end of summer, early fall, and so those food sources that they normally had at that time weren't as plentiful, weren't as available, then they're going to, and couple that with a year when there's very little acorn production in some areas, then they're not able to go into the winter in great condition. They don't have that fat reserve, and so they're going to have to spend more time recuperating when things start greening back up in the early spring and on into the summer. So with the cold weather, it seems that deer in the south just tend to hunker down when it gets really cold like that, and they don't do a lot of moving. So being that it was 3 or 4 or 5 days in a row, I don't know that it would have that significant of an impact on them later on in that year. Now, if it was in a situation where they were already in poor condition, it would probably have some effect on them. But I think the biggest impact is going to be what was happening before late summer on into the fall, primarily related to food supplies and then acorn production. Because if they're not able to come out of the winter in pretty good condition, where they're not having to play catch up like they do in poor years, then they can put more of those excess resources into antler growth. But if they're just trying to recuperate it takes them longer to recuperate coming out of those poor years, then they have less excess to put into antler growth.
Well, say up here, the very, very minimal acorns. So acorns is basically more for fat or carbs,
Right.
whatever, right? So they didn't have that to kind of fatten up more. So, and then they tie that in with the drought.
Yeah.
And then the extra cold weather, they had to burn more calories, I guess, to stay kind of warm.
They use that fat to carry them through the winter and times when food's just not as plentiful. And so if it was already less plentiful than before because of the drought, and then they have the fewer acorns, then it's just a double whammy. They're entering the acorn drop in poorer condition than they did in typical years, and then they don't have the acorn crop to build those fat reserves to help them through the winter. So they're coming out. They potentially are coming out of the winter in as poor condition as you couldn't have drawn up a worse scenario if you needed to. But fortunately, in the south,
affect fawns too. Production.
What you see a lot of times in years like that, fawns you'll see they get susceptible to lungworm infestations, and so they get a lot of them. They're in the bronchial tubes and into the lungs, and get a lot of them. They will get pneumonia, and you typically see that, or I've seen that more commonly in rough years like that.
Wow.
But if
I was leaning more about how many fawns are being born.
And so they will be the ones that would be more susceptible to not making it through those tough times, because if the doe was not in as good a condition, and so she wasn't, like I was talking about earlier, producing as much milk as she normally would, then that fawn wouldn't be as good a condition than if they don't have the acorns to help them build fat. So they're going to be the most likely to, if anything, bad was to happen with the cold snaps, it would probably be with fawns, more so than the adult deer, just because it's relatively a short-term thing. But with a fawn, it probably wouldn't take that much to cause them to, because they're on their own, they're completely weaned, so they don't have many fat reserves, if at all. Even in good years, they don't have a whole lot of fat on them in the winter.
Well, how would that, like the doe being bred, would she instead of having 2 to 3 fawns, would I have just one because of this crazy scenario?
It'll depend on, how good the spring and early summer is, but it potentially, what we've seen over the years with all the data we collected from, when we were looking at conception dates all around the state, just about every year the number of fetuses in utero, that they were carrying was the same. It was the potential to have a lot of fawns is there every year. But what happens once they hit the ground is probably more concerning than anything. But if again, if a doe's coming into winter in really poor condition, then the likelihood of her, even though she's carrying 2 fetuses, the likelihood of her giving birth to 2 healthy ones is probably reduced, and so there may be a higher incidence of stillborn fawns, or her abandoning one of them or both of them once they're born, because she's in survival mode because she's in such poor condition. But hopefully it won't be that way. Hopefully the things will warm up and stay warm, and things start greening up pretty quick, and they can start getting themselves in better condition and raising fawns. But the potential is always there for something like that to affect how many fawns actually survive or are actually born live and then survive on into next year's recruitment class.
Well, I really appreciate talking to you. We went over not a whole lot of topics, but I did a bunch of information, so it's been fantastic.
A lot of babbling.
So, the CWD thing is kind of disheartening to an extent, but hey, we got to live with it. So, y'all kind of do a little study on your own, maybe a little research, but this guy's been doing this for, 30-something years, so take a lot of that to your heart. But again, there's other studies and stuff going on too, so you can kind of look that up. And I would look up actual like research facilities, like college facilities and stuff like that, versus Joe Blow or whatever. So.
Yeah, they're a good source for chronic wasting disease info is the CWD Alliance. They try to keep stuff updated. Then there's usually there's, like Michael said, look for the source of the information you look at. Yeah. If it's Joe Blow Hunter from wherever, you might be a little bit skeptical of what they have to say, as opposed to somebody, say, from the SCWDS at the University of Georgia, researcher over there, or from researchers with some of these agencies that are doing some pretty interesting long-term research on the impacts of CWD out of Arkansas and Tennessee, West Virginia, for example. So there's a lot of good info out there with anything, so especially CWD. So just be skeptical about or careful about what you right. How much faith you put into what you're reading, and if you have questions, and reach out to your game and fish agency. Hopefully they can provide you some good info to
not everything on the internet's true now. Yeah. Not everything on the internet's true. Or Facebook especially. So.
Yeah, that's right.
But anyway, appreciate it. Good talking to you, brother. Appreciate it.
Anytime.
Hey, appreciate y'all watching. Time preparation for the next season. Time to be doing it. Post-season scout and all that. So, hey, get ready. It's time to get them flat. See y'all. Hey, everybody. Thank y'all for watching the videos. Well, again, we appreciate y'all's support. If you haven't liked, please like and subscribe. And don't care if you haven't got one of our books, check out Amazon and get a book. Also, we got a link on there where you can, on our YouTube channel, where you can go on. We got a little store set up, like if you're interested in any kind of merchandise, shirts and stuff, you can check that out. And we really appreciate anything like that. So, again, we appreciate y'all's support. Keep watching. We're going to keep trying to share the outdoors and how we do some things, and try to help everybody that we can enjoy the outdoors. And we do this for just basically because of the environment and the community that's involved and built around hunting. So again, we appreciate y'all. Like, share, and we'll see y'all again. Bye.